The Minolta Auto Tele Rokkor-QF 200mm f3.5 was made in Japan and first introduced on the market in 1959. At the time, there were only a handful of lenses available for the Minolta SR system, and this Rokkor was one of them. The lens discussed in this video is the second version, which Minolta released in 1963. It has an all-black metal body with an aperture ring located in the middle of the lens. This version does not have a built-in lens hood. There are 3 subsequent versions of this lens. In 1966, Minolta updated it as the MC Tele Rokkor-QF. The lens continued to be made entirely out of metal, but now Minolta added a built-in lens hood and changed the aperture ring from black to silver. In 1970, the lens changed again. This time the silver aperture ring was moved to the back of the lens, but Minolta kept the all-metal body and the built-in lens hood. And in 1974, Minolta released the final version of this telephoto lens, the MC Tele Rokkor-QF, which also had the built-in lens hood, but now the aperture ring became black like the rest of the body, and the focusing ring changed from metal to rubber. Besides the small differences in appearance, all versions of this lens have the same optics, and only their coatings improved with time. Back in 1964, this lens sold for $199.50, which made it one of the most expensive lenses in Minolta's SR system. The letters QF, seen here on the front plate, represent the optical formula of this lens. The first letter indicates the number of groups, and the second letter indicates the number of glass elements. In this case, the letter Q is short for quattuor, which means 4 in Latin, and the letter F is the 6th letter in the alphabet. Therefore, this lens has 4 groups and 6 elements. This lens accepts filters with 67mm diameter. Aperture ranges from f3.5 to f22 with click stops in between. The diaphragm is made of 8 rounded aperture blades. On the back, this lens has Minolta SR mount. I use Minolta to NEX adapter, which allows me to use this lens on my Sony camera. Focus throw is approximately 280 degrees. This lens weighs 766 grams. Minimum focusing distance from your subject to your film plane or sensor is 2.5 meters. The Minolta Auto Tele Rokkor-QF 200mm f3.5 is a fantastic lens that produces beautiful images with unique character. It is also one of the best bargains out there for a vintage prime lens in this focal length. Even though it used to sell for $200 back in 1964, now it can be found for ridiculously low prices on the used market. And considering that it has an optical design that is more than 60 years old, it is shocking how good this Minolta can be. First of all, this telephoto lens has excellent resolution even wide open, and its sharpness is almost perfect across the whole frame, with just some slight softness along the edges. Stop down just one stop to f5.6, its resolution becomes amazing across the entire image. By f8, things are simply perfect. And by f11, diffraction starts to creep in a bit, and the image is slightly less sharp, but still quite usable. The colors from this Rokkor have a very unique look. I find them to be true to the colors in reality, but they also have certain hues and tones that remind me of photographs from the 60s and the 70s. It's really hard to describe them, but the colors from this lens have a very distinct vintage appearance. Contrast and saturation are also quite good, but since this Minolta was made before multi-coating became standard practice, it doesn't produce very contrasty or overly saturated images, which I think contributes to the classic look that it creates. The autofocus blur from this Minolta is phenomenal, especially when shot at closer distances. It has buttery smooth bokeh and amazing subject separation. I personally love what this lens can do when shot at its maximum aperture. Once again, it has a character of its own that I'm very fond of. There is some vignetting at f3.5, but by f8 it's completely gone and it's not a problem at all. This Rokkor lens has no issues whatsoever when it comes to distortion, and vertical and horizontal lines stay nice and straight without any need for post-processing. If you point this lens towards the sun, you will get some veiling flare with some loss of contrast and a bit of ghosting, as seen in this example, so have that in mind. Since this is a quite early telephoto lens, I wasn't expecting any miracles when it comes to chromatic aberrations, but surprisingly, color fringing is not nearly as bad as I've seen in some other vintage telephoto lenses. Yes, there is some fringing in challenging situations, as seen here in the highlights of the water of this shot, and also here in this backlit tree where you can see some green and magenta fringing. But this is easily corrected in post, and for me it's definitely not a deal breaker, because this lens has so many great qualities that I like. Since my version of this lens is from the early 60s, its build quality, as you can imagine, is absolutely phenomenal. It is made entirely out of metal and it feels super sturdy. Just a great construction all around with incredibly smooth focusing mechanism and gorgeous design. Coming in at almost 800 grams, this is not what I'll call a lightweight lens, but it's also not super heavy, and I had no issues shooting it handheld. So overall, I think this is a killer lens and I really enjoyed using it. It's got great sharpness, beautiful bokeh, really unique color rendering, and no distortion whatsoever. And on top of that, it's built like a tank, and best of all, can be found for super low prices on the used market. I love this lens and I'm really glad that I got to try it out. If you're looking for an extremely affordable telephoto lens with tons of great qualities and a distinct vintage look, definitely check out the Minolta Auto Tele Rokkor-QF 200mm f3.5. And if you're curious how this lens performs for video, here are a few clips that I shot with it at f8. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time here at Vintage Optics.